Hi, I'm Philip Walker. I'm going to be talking to you this morning about an experiment that I did uh, on my module at the University of Leeds. It's a first year module. It's about calculus. Well, the bit that I teach is about calculus. And I'll explain some of the educational rationale for what I did involving e-assessment, and then talk about some of the outcomes and the experience. So I'm going to set the scene in terms of some of my thinking about where this came from first. So part of what my thinking was starting to think through, well, what do we really mean when we write learning outcomes? We talk a lot about learning outcomes, and we know, I think, a lot of us kind of vaguely how to write learning outcomes, but what are we pitching for? When we write a statement of learning outcomes, particularly in a module specification or catalogue or whatever it is you call it, are we writing something that's a threshold for attainment for a pass level? Are we writing something that's a threshold attainment for a first? A lot of the time, what I see looks like a mixture of the two. So it's neither fish nor fowl. It's not. It's not what you need to do to pass the module. Sometimes it's not what you need to do to get a first. Sometimes we're encouraged to write things that stretch through the Bloom's taxonomy of the different things that you might do, but realistically, all that means is you end up with a really confused student, a really confused module catalogue entry, where they're thinking, you know, some of this is just memorizing or applying or understanding. Some of this is creating a proof of my own or something like that. This can't all be for the same level of attainment, and indeed it's not. So some of that was just thinking through, okay, what are learning outcomes? What do we really mean by them? Where do they sit in terms of attainment? So then I started to think through, well, what does it mean to pass the module? And I thought, well, there are pass level skills and there are higher level skills. And your pass level skills, taking my calculus bit of the module as the context, the pass level skills are these core mathematical skills that are routine, they're calculation based, and in this instance they can be marked by a computer really straightforwardly. And that's what you need to do to be able to get a pass. But then to get a higher mark, you're talking there about the higher order skills, which are more conceptual, they're less routine. You need to show your working out, you need to explain your reasoning. That all necessitates paper-based assessment or some facsimile of that in an online environment. It needs a human being to mark it and to assess it. You can't just do it by computer. So I thought, well, why don't I separate out those two things in an assessment? I have a colleague at Leeds who points out quite a lot that exams are not a good vehicle for doing these two jobs. We want to separate out the two tasks. One of them is that binary question of have you got the basics down well enough to pass the module, and the other is that more fine-tuned judgment of, okay, so if you have got the basics down, where do you sit on the spectrum from a 40 to 100? Or, yeah, whatever your pass mark is. And then the other thing that was starting to dawn on me was, why am I marking so many blinking resits? So at our university, students get a resit opportunity if they've failed. I'm sure that's fairly common in lots of higher education settings. And so if they failed the module, they have to take it again. They have to score at least a pass level understanding, and then they get their mark capped at whatever the pass mark is for the module. So could I find a way of reducing the marking burden, not only in the main sit, but also in the resit period, possibly even reducing the number of resits without sacrificing standards? So I'm still persuaded that students have met the learning outcomes that they need to meet to get a pass, but can I do that in a way that might make it a bit more straightforward for students to demonstrate those learning outcomes, and also make it a bit more straightforward for me to check that they've demonstrated those learning outcomes, both in the main sit and in the resit period. So that leads me into, well, what did I do? I split out the assessment, and so I ran what I've called, I think I need a better name, but a hybrid assessment. Really, it's a two-component assessment. So you've got a pass-fail assessment, which is automatically marked. We used the DOIS system. I gave students 1,000 attempts. and the marking basis is all or nothing. So you've either got it right or you haven't, and you have to get 100% across all of the questions. I split them off into sections, so it wasn't like you had to get everything right all at once. You could work on this bit, get it right, then move on to the next bit, work on that, get it right. So you had to get 100% on all 4 parts that I set, automatically marked. You get as many attempts as you need, effectively, at each part. And then that contributed to the mark on a pass-fail basis. So you'd either get a fail mark, and in our institution we have a way of kind of noting a non-numeric fail mark for students, so I was making use of that. Or you would get a pass, right, so that gets you a 40, and then there's a written assessment. We use the Gradescope system, our university brought that in, and rather than having all these attempts to tick off your core learning outcomes, you get one submission. Well, you can resubmit up to the deadline, but you've got one thing that I'm going to mark. The marking there is manual. It's marked in effect out of 60, and then I just take the 40 from your pass fail, add on whatever you get out of 60, and that gives you your mark overall. And so whereas the automatic assessment is going to be included, if you need to resit for a second attempt, it'll be included in that. This written assessment won't be included in a second attempt because you're just resitting for a capped mark. Still have to write a resit for August because there are some students who are ill or whatever in the main sit who need to resit for the full range of the mark. So I don't get out of writing a resit, but I don't have to mark so many. So the automatic thing is in the second attempt. And whereas the content of the automatic thing is basic skills, the content of the written assessment is very challenging. In fact, it has to be very challenging if you think about it, because what I have to do is write an assessment that assumes you've got all those basic skills down, right? So the content of the written assessment becomes everything that you might expect to do from a mark of 40 upwards. So you have to think very differently about what you're setting. So here are some assessment results, just so that you can see what went on. AB means absent, and then fails, and then the average mark for the assessment. And if you look at the module that I'm teaching, in fact, has 2 strands that can be compared side by side. So there's a calculus strand and a linear algebra strand. I teach the calculus strand and a colleague teaches linear algebra. And so you can see that actually the absence rate, perhaps unsurprisingly, tracks between the 2 sections. So students who don't bother submitting on the one typically don't bother submitting on the other. The fail rate jumped up in 2019-20. I do remember I looked at that recently again, and I now can't remember what the reason was, but we did work out. I think there was a question on my side that turned out to be much harder than expected on the written assessment, and the average mark as a result dropped. So the calculus bit, I did this experiment. The linear algebra was just a traditional paper style exam where you just had to get a mark of 40% on it to pass. And so you can kind of see that in some ways my implementation of this experimental assessment method marked a return to normal from the point of view of student outcomes on the assessment, right, where the fail rate came back down, the average mark moved significantly back up towards where it was, while the linear algebra in some ways maintained the performance of the previous year. And of course, this year is pandemic situation, as we all know. Last year wasn't, because it was the January sit, so this was just before the world blew up. But the A-level system had changed as well, and it may be that the A-level syllabus changes had some impact on student outcomes on the assessment in both cases. But you can kind of see there's a natural control, right? And so you can see that in some ways my assessment marked a return to normal even in abnormal circumstances. I then did a survey of students to find out what their experience was like, because part of the motivation for this was to give students an assessment that was going to feel less stressful, right? If you're doing this automatic assessment, you can keep doing it until you know you've passed, then you know you've passed, right? So rather than going into an assessment not knowing whether you've passed, you can at least come out of it knowing that you've passed, and then go into the written bit with that pass in your belt. So just to give you an idea of the population that responded to my survey, you can see that it tracks relatively well the survey population in terms of their outcomes against the module as a whole. Maybe the survey slightly overrepresents the views of students who did quite well, so the 70 plus range, relative to students who did particularly the 40 to 49 range, where the surveys sort of slightly lagged the module. I haven't tried to do any statistical adjustment of the survey results to get them to fit module results. Or, pardon me, I did ask some demographic data as well. I haven't done any adjustment to try to get any sort of fit against those data. But that just gives you an idea. And the numbers reported there are self-reported by the students, because the whole thing was anonymous. So here are some of the key questions that I asked them to agree, disagree with, and so on. So I said the key question for me really was, would you like more of this? Would you like more end of semester assessments that contain components where I can know that I've secured a pass mark? And the answer was yes, right? I think it was just one of them who said, no, I'm not. Right, so out of 65, you can see almost all of them said yes. And that's perhaps unsurprising, right? If we said to students, would you like an assessment where you know exactly what mark you're going to get? They would probably say yes. So certainly saying, well, you can know whether you've passed or failed, they're gonna go for that. So it's perhaps not unsurprising, but it's encouraging to see that it did indeed, it was something that they liked. And then obviously I was trying to drill into, well, why might you like that? So I asked them, relative to the paper assessment, do you feel that it was more help for consolidating your skills? And again, you can see the vast majority of them agree that actually relative to this very stretching assessment, the basic one where they might have had to have done several attempts. I did look at those data, and I do have those data. And so some of them, knocked stuff out straight away, and some of them took several attempts to get it right. So they're saying relative to the paper assessment, it was more help for consolidating their skills, because I guess they were doing it multiple times. I didn't get much by way of commentary on that point, but I imagine that that's what's going on. And then by the time you were taking the assessment, do you feel that you understood how it would contribute to your overall score on the module? So I was a bit concerned, did they really understand what was going on? Did they really understand how it was going to work? And again, you can see the vast majority were saying, yeah, they basically understood what was going on with the assessment. They knew how it was going to work. One of them said they didn't understand at all, although I think a couple of others, based on some of their other answers, probably didn't really understand what was going on either, even if they thought they did. But you can see that actually they felt that they understood, and I would say some of that is the signposting that I did. I talked about it, I flagged it up early in lectures in a kind of vague way. I talked about it in revision week in more detail. I sent them an email explaining it, and I think I explained it once more by email again before the assessment period, just to make sure that I'd really bombarded them and they knew they had to do this assessment alongside the other bits of assessment that they had to do, because I was really worried that I could have a lot of them failing just because they didn't realise that there was this assessment they had to do, and that was going to be a disaster. So it wasn't a disaster, and I made sure that I communicated it strongly, and I'd have to keep making sure that I communicate that strongly. I then gave them some free comments to talk about stuff, and the comments principally focused on one of the other things that I was trying to get at, which was this business about calming nerves, building confidence, the kind of psychological effect of knowing that you've passed before you then tackle the paper assessment. And you can see a lot of them using phrases like more confident, relaxed, less stress, calm, less pressure, at ease. So once they know that they've passed, they then felt able to tackle the assessment and I'll talk a bit about some of the impact that that had in a moment. So there was some mention of input format. I'm sure many of us who've done e-assessment things know that not all students get on equally well with the input format, and so so there was some mention of, you know, well, the computer didn't always understand what I was telling it, which is normally code, but I wasn't typing in sufficiently precisely what I wanted the computer to understand. They did have practice opportunities throughout the semester, actually on the questions that I set in almost all cases. I think there might have been one question that I set that I hadn't used in semester. So they had practice opportunities with the format and actually with the questions as well. So the fact that their nerves were calmed and they built confidence did give rise to some interesting changes to assessment strategy. So some comments suggested, for example, that they were focusing on the other strand of the assessment, on the linear algebra bit, because passing was uncertain there. So they junked my written assessment or didn't do much with it, and then focused on the linear algebra assessment because they thought, well, I really need to make sure I pass this in order to pass the module, which strategically makes sense, right? And then the other thing that they did was on my bit, they felt, and I saw this in the scripts, they clearly felt able to ignore questions that were too difficult. So again, that classic exam thing of I'm going to try literally everything, they weren't doing that. They were ignoring bits that they felt were too difficult because they didn't feel under pressure to pick up piddling little marks here and there for writing something down. Which in our context, given the assessment format that we'd been required to run institutionally, was actually to the good, because we wanted to make sure that students didn't feel overworked in the assessment period. So actually encouraging students that that sort of standard strategy was not something they should be following. They should be focusing on the bits they could do rather than picking up marks everywhere and spending too much time. That was something important. And there were some comments noting that the written part was very challenging, which I was encouraged by because it was meant to be, because of course there was no pass level material, not intended to be any pass level material in the written part. Okay, so in conclusion, to summarize what I found from running this little experiment, this form of assessment, hybrid assessment, I really need a better name, is effective in reducing the amount of marking that you have to do. I certainly found that. And it provides gains to student experience and to student perceptions of learning, while still being robust in terms of making sure that students meet the standard that you're expecting them to meet, and providing an assessment that gives you confidence that it's returning marks that are plausible for your cohort. One of the things I learned, well, I sort of already knew, but I saw in action, was the importance of signposting, especially when it's something that's going to be unfamiliar, new, a bit unusual in this way. So flagging things up, revision week video, follow-up email, information in the assessment folder. So on our VLE, where all the assessment materials were put, I made sure that there was information there as well, so students didn't have any excuse. You know, they'd gone to the folder and they would see, you have to do this and this is why. And finally, just to say, there is still, I think, further follow-up work that's needed to see whether this change in assessment format has longer term effects on student learning. They felt it was better for consolidating skills, but did it really have that effect? We'll have to see really next year. For various reasons, this semester is not going to be a context in which we're going to make much headway on that question, but maybe next year we might start to see some whether there's some effect in terms of student learning. Okay, well, thank you for watching, if indeed you still are, and you've got my contact details there, but also I'll be answering questions in the session. That's my intention, so I'll see you then.